I found myself holed up in the ferry port of Karlskrona on the southern tip of Sweden, wondering how I was going to get back to Poland, which had put up restrictions against non-Polish citizens entering the country. I started to get cabin fever in the small town. Alright, the thing about these drying units is they don't bloody well work. No bloody towels, the thing doesn't work, so I walk around with wet hands. What do? Dry them on my bloody jeans. These bloody cards. Why don't they just use keys? It led me down a rather unusual track as I started to hatch a plot to enter the country under the radar. Surely, in a small leisure vessel, I might skip across the Baltic, creep into a little harbour somewhere, perhaps at break of dawn, Gdansk or Gdynia, drop anchor and row ashore under cover of darkness, eluding customs. I was now putting the next chief suspect in the dock, the politicians, and went looking for a secluded spot where I could reflect on the matter. I had found the doctors not guilty on the simple basis that it is their job to paint a worst-case scenario, especially to those who might not be inclined to listen. As a class, the epidemiologists seem more prone to exaggeration than most in the medical profession, especially Neil Ferguson and Imperial College, whose modelling strategy was clearly to grossly inflate forecasted deaths, cozying up to the government in order to ensure that measures implemented were then followed by a much lower actual deaths figure, for which the politicians could of course then take the credit. But in truth, the doctors were just advisers. It was for the government to decide whether to listen and to weigh, in the balance, other factors. Had they done so, or had they rushed headlong into extreme measures without following a proper, cool-headed, deliberative process? All right, so we've explored the issue of doctors, and more and more, I'm of a view that you can't really hold the doctors for account that they were doing what they were required to do. And furthermore, I mean, when you look at Dr. Anthony Fauci in the House of Representatives committee back in March, I mean, he's being put on the spot.
Can you give us some projections?
It is going to be totally dependent upon how we respond to it. So I can't give you a number.
There's a panel of politicians. They're up on a raised dais around the rather spacious and intimidating House of Representatives committee inquiry room, and they're saying, look, tell us how many deaths, we want to know. Oh, well, I don't know, could be millions.
If we now sit back complacently...
I'm not asking to be complacent, I'm asking for a realistic, that's what the public is looking for.
I can't give you a realistic number until we put into the factor of how we respond. If we are complacent and don't do really aggressive containment and mitigation, the number could go way up and be involved in many, many millions.
Okay, so now let's turn our attentions to the United Kingdom. And before I say anything, I should just first say that I appreciate that a decision has been made, okay? And I like the fact that the British people, a decision having been made by their government, they respect the government, who've presumably taken proper advice on the issue. They don't know. Members of the public aren't medical scientists. They aren't high levels of government. They're not sitting around a cabinet table where they're all actually feeding information to the Prime Minister so that he can make a balanced decision about things. We don't know what the economic impacts are, so we've entrusted the politicians, as we do once every 5 years, with the decision-making process, and we want to trust them to make the right decision. So they've made the decision, and then that pact, that trust, then means we follow the guidance that we're given. Indeed, we have embraced the guidance, I would say, in the United Kingdom. Now, you may be thinking, well, look, Mr. Woods, Mr. legal detective, lawyer investigates guy, whatever you're calling yourself, the decision's been made. Just get on with it. It's history, and now knuckle down and a little bit of the Battle of Britain spirit. Just carry on, keep calm and carry on. But let me just pose this question for you. Sure, decision being made, by Churchill, the Second World War. It was the right decision to go to war with Germany, and fine. So we rallied together and we fought a common enemy. And critically, we then discovered, particularly towards the end of the war, when the soldiers started to stumble over concentration camps, we then discovered that our decision was or had been vindicated. The analogy with the Second World War was no idle comparison. Such extreme measures had never been seen in wartime, let alone peacetime, according to this highly distinguished Supreme Court judge.
During the COVID-19 pandemic, the British state has exercised coercive powers over its citizens on a scale never previously attempted. It has taken effective legal control enforced by the police over the personal lives of the entire population, where they could go, whom they could meet, what they could do, even within their own homes. For 3 months, it placed everybody under a form of house arrest, qualified only by their right to do a limited number of things approved by ministers. All of this has been authorized by ministerial decree with minimal parliamentary involvement. It has been the most significant interference with personal freedom in the history of our country. We have never sought to do such a thing before, even in wartime, and even when faced with health crises far more serious than this one.
Where such extreme measures are imposed, surely you do have to make sure that the correct decision-making process has been followed. So, surely you've got to start to think, well, okay, the National Health Service has been saved, the hospitals haven't been overrun, we've managed that situation, and actually the trust that we put into the politicians, and they made the decision and they told us that we're going into lockdown in order to save the NHS, that decision has now sort of strangely and subtly changed. There's a new plan, and having bought into the first plan, shouldn't we have an opportunity to buy into the second plan? I'm sure when we first put our trust in the government to take the steps that they took it in total lockdown, we were hopeful that once the national health was being saved, that was what we were being told, then we could move out of lockdown, and hopefully reasonably rapidly. But now there's a fresh agenda that's emerged over the past week or two. The fancy signs on the daily corona press briefings have been saved, the NHS has been dropped, and you've got another one, stay alert, whatever that may mean. Because it seems as if we've been extremely alert to date, and we've been an incredibly obedient nation. Perhaps I was wrong to question the assessment that the health service was overwhelmed. Look at these headlines. Except that these are headlines from previous winter years. So even the explanation that we were saving the health service was quite possibly flawed. Routinely, this is the cry during the winter months. Were the extraordinary and extreme measures of lockdown really now the solution to this historical problem? It did seem to me that there was a serious problem, but the question was whether there had been proper debate on the long-term consequences of these extreme measures, which seem to have no clear end date. You get a box with a sandwich in it, and you take that, and then if you want a boiled egg, you can have a boiled egg, and then there's just some basics and some coffee and tea, and then you sit down and you keep your distance. I just think it's admirable that this just feels right. It just feels like they're taking the thing seriously. They are taking steps, but they're measured and proportionate steps. How's that? Good to see a bottle of sanitizer on the cash register. Oh, I've got to enter my PIN, have I?
Yeah.
You have
Herring.
herring.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Pickled herring.
Yeah,
You put it in a jar and you pickle it,
yeah,
or you can fry it, I guess, if you want.
yeah.
It's delicious, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's now in May. So
Can I hire a boat here? Do people rent boats or sell
yeah,
boats? Where would I go to hire a boat?
1852
1852.
is a store.
Okay.
Some issues with the engine. So
My
we're
project
thinking
was
about
taking
changing
shape
that.
and I was starting
Going
to
electric,
pester
but I haven't
unwary
finished
sailors. Installing a new engine, that's quite a big job, isn't it?
it. Yeah, yeah.
In a boat. So, I mean, how much would a boat like this cost? Are you...
I would say like 50,000 Swedish krona.
Okay. I now started to plot my journey, happy at least that I'd taken a decision and was taking positive action. 50,000 kroner, sorry, so that's not all that expensive, it's about £5,000. He says a Maxi 77 is the boat I want, and it's about 25,000 kroner. But was a small sailing boat really up to the task of a single-handed two-night voyage across the Baltic?
You won't freeze to death. And
I like the design.
yeah, it's a rough one.
Government had managed to conjure money out of thin air to deal with the crisis, so why couldn't I do the same? That's aluminium, is it? Oh, of course, stainless steel would rust in a minute, wouldn't it?
So
You can see why, you know, people are prepared to spend a lot of money on boats, because you just feel like, as a man, a sense of control, a sense of power, a sense of purpose.
The government has, in my view, passed regulations which it had no power to pass. They are therefore liable to be quashed on judicial review. I have not suggested that the government could not have done all the things it has done under other statutes, but it would have had to submit to a much more stringent regime of parliamentary supervision, which it didn't want to do.
Lord Sumption's argument was that the government's decision was illegal as well as poorly made, and I could see the force in this. They had not used the Civil Contingencies Act, designed for pandemics. They had instead created new legislation, the Coronavirus Act, and bolted onto it the old Public Health Act 1984. In doing so, they managed to avoid having the matter debated in Parliament, as that act did not have stringent checks and balances, requiring routine parliamentary scrutiny. How was it that they decided to ignore legislation expressly designed to deal with the sort of crisis with which we were faced, drafted during times of cooler heads? It was also a concern that they seemed fatally welded to the advice of the mathematical modellers and did not seek a second opinion, replace those experts, even after those models were comprehensively discredited.
This isn't a debate between world-renowned scientific experts, like Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance, and, John on the internet who goes, I don't think it's a good idea. This is a major scientific debate based on the data and based on the facts. The data that we were offered for going into lockdown originally, the one that you were not very keen on, was a lie. It wasn't just a matter of debate. It was certifiably, provably, at the time, known to be untrue, and would have been known to be untrue by both Patrick Vallance and Chris Whitty. I'm citing the 4,000 a day possibility. Virtually every single thing that's been spouted in terms of a computer model so far in this whole pandemic has been shown to be untrue.
As I sat on my outcrop of rock in Karlskrona, Sweden, had I looked into a crystal ball, I would have seen that even in the autumn they were making the same ridiculous forecasts. So in avoiding any proper scrutiny, discussion, debate in Parliament, they were also able to avoid the danger of any inconvenient other facts being raised, such as the WHO in 2019 having produced guidance, again, expressly in relation to pandemics.
Unsurprisingly, the WHO, culmination of 100 years of pandemic management science, in October 19 said no recommendation to quarantine exposed individuals once a virus is out and about in a community or a region. Not recommended, never mind quarantining or locking down of whole populations. They didn't even cover that because it would have been too absurd. But in February 2020, we threw out the rule book of a century.
I want to say it again, we in the World Health Organization do not advocate lockdowns as a primary means of control of this virus.
It was 7 weeks before it came in front of Parliament for discussion in May. And even then, only 50 parliamentarians were allowed in the chamber at any one time, out of a total of 650. Question time became a press conference with a limited number of MPs privileged enough to pose questions, but only online.
To increase to 40% in July. At the same time, they're offering savers a pathetic interest rate of 0.1%. Yet these are the same banks that were saved by billions and billions of pounds of taxpayers' money. What on earth is going on? When are the banks going to act in the national interest?
Card limits. By the first week of April, 1.2 million mortgage payment holidays had been granted, and in this national effort, as we pay tribute to those across the country who are stepping up to the plate, we certainly expect the banks to do their bit.
Again, looking into my crystal ball, it seemed that an impact assessment of the measures hadn't even been done as late as the autumn, as an ex-Prime Minister was concerned to point out.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first of all say to
Boris was not very interested and left the House as she
decisions
started
that they're
to
having
talk.
to take and the difficult position that they find themselves in. But there's one set of data that has not been available throughout, and that is a lack of data about the costs of the decisions that are being taken. Costs for non-COVID treatment in NHS, non-COVID deaths, domestic abuse, mental health, possibly more suicides, and of course cost to the economy. Jobs lost, livelihoods shattered, businesses failing, whole sectors damaged. What sort of airline industry are we going to have coming out of this? What sort of hospitality sector? How many small independent shops will be left? The government must have made this analysis, they must have made this assessment, let us see it and make our own judgments. The public and Parliament want to support the government to take the right decisions. To do that, we need to have the right figures, the right data and the proper information.
Those long-term issues actually meant direct deaths, as evidenced in 3 separate studies that Karlskrona, the cancer specialist, had warned me about. But such concerns were in the long-distant future and had little bearing on the political decisions being made in the heat of the moment now. Well, yeah, you mean the fuel is going to cost more than the bloody boat? What about we use an older engine and you just sell me the boat? How much is the boat itself without the engine?
I can't sell you just the boat.
Why not?
No, I don't do that. It's packed steel and everything.
Okay,
so,
I understand. Do you live on the island here?
No, I'm outside, about 1 mile from here.
But the motorboat idea suddenly seemed foolish. I even quizzed the receptionist, angling for information about her husband's boat, seeing whether it was the right spec. Well, but it's a motorboat.
Yeah, it's like you can sleep in it and everything.
You can sleep in it?
Yeah.
Has it got like a drinks cabinet for alcohol?
Yeah, a little.
I bet you've got, yeah. But is it, how big is it?
I can, it's about, you can see the...
Yeah? Oh, it's like one of those boats out there, is it?
Yes, we have it outside here, but you can see it.
You've got it here?
Yeah.
Now that is a really nice little boat. That's the receptionist's boat. Well, it's her husband's boat. She's got children, he's got his boat. But while she seemed keen, he was hardly likely to sell. After all, it was his floating shed at the bottom of the garden. And then I found it. A perfect small day sailor that must be affordable, and it was on the dock right outside my bedroom window. There she is, Pearl. Looks like a nice little weather-beaten sailing vessel, just perfect to get me across the Baltic to Poland. All that was needed now was to trace the owner and persuade him to sell. I laid in wait. I'm holding in my hands here a, really rather capacious, lengthy letter. Capacious is a bit of a silly word, isn't it? It's 102 paragraphs. It's written by a law firm and they're suing the government. This is actually addressed to the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care, Matt Hancock. And they have been instructed by Simon Dolan, who is a businessman who runs an aviation company of a few hundred people, who's unhappy about the economic impacts and is challenging the decision of the government to go into lockdown by way of judicial review. So what is judicial review? Well, in short, it's where a judge forms a judgment about the legality of a decision that is made by typically a public body. Most commonly these cases involve local authorities, councils, big public bodies, and of course this is like the top of the tree, a decision made by the government, presumably in cabinet itself. And this is the critical thing, because an application for judicial review is not necessarily saying that a decision is wrong. It's saying that there was no proper process. The decision-making process itself was flawed. Now, you may think, well, aren't you, splitting hairs here? Well, I think it's, quite important for a public body, and particularly a government, to be seen to be making the right and seen to be making informed decisions, and seen to be making a proper process. For example, if I told you that Boris Johnson had sat round the fire with his cigar and a brandy with Dominic Cummings and a few cronies, and the decision to lock down the entire country, to remove civil liberties, to risk destroying the economy for a period of time, you might think, oh, I see, that a decision was arrived at in that way, was it? As opposed to a decision arrived by a parliamentary committee of experts who knew their topic and knew their subject, by Parliament itself, and and so on and so forth. You'd have more confidence in the decision that was made in the latter way, and that's really critical, I think, in this issue, that particularly where we are feeling, hang on, was the right decision made, that we can, honestly say that we trusted the government institutions of government, the machinery of government, and the decision was made in the right and proper way. So that's what an application for judicial review. Obviously, if an application for judicial review is successful, then it does raise questions over the decision itself. And this is something that this document obviously majors on. It's quite an interesting read if you're a lawyer. And one of all the very many things I can talk about, I'll just talk about one thing, and that is that constantly throughout it raises the issue of proportionality and reasonable steps and restrictions that are made where a minister has had proper consideration for the impacts of the steps that is taken. There's a framework of legislation that preceded the Coronavirus Act and its 2 amendments, I think, that was put into place during cooler-headed times, perhaps, a number of years ago. Parliamentarians, legislators, draftsmen carefully drafted statutes to deal with pandemics like this one. Dissenting views were almost entirely marginalised in the media, with only a small outlier radio station left to carry the banner.
Because I think we've got to take these measures to try and keep this horrid pandemic under control.
But there's no medical evidence for it.
Well, I'm sorry, but you say there's no evidence for it.
No, the government hasn't produced any evidence for it.
I'm sorry, the government's got the job, Julia, of governing the country. It's got to make decisions. They
Based
may
on
not
evidence.
Be popular. I mean, I don't want to be in Tier 2 out here in Beckenham. I don't want that. I want us to actually have full freedom.
Oh, well, you all want that. But we haven't all got the choice to vote for it. No, but I'm all in favour of us doing things that will stop the spread of the virus, and it should be proportionate to the threat of the virus. There is no medical or scientific evidence or data of any kind to support a lot of the government's restrictions. Why are you voting for them?
Well, because I actually believe in it. Look,
you believe in it, even though there's no evidence. You just told me that we need to listen to the scientists.
I'm sorry. Are you shouting at me? Because I'm
a voter. I've got the right to shout.
And
at
finally, and
politicians when
perhaps
you do
most
stupid
importantly,
things. Yes, I am
Parliament was not given the chance to properly scrutinise
and I've known you for years. I
whether
think
the
you're a moral
lockdowns
man
were
to
actually
vote for
working at
something
all.
that you know is wrong.
You've got to do it, Julia. That's why I'm. Look, this is a time when we've got to actually support the Prime Minister. We've got. Oh, yeah, all right, fine. You scoff. I mean, that's your job to scoff.
No, it's my job to hold politicians to account.
Well, I'm answering. No, he views the point that he's had this advice from the people he considers to be the experts.
Was the evidence so conclusive that lockdown saved lives?
Fine. I get that.
Would you trust
this was
an
a
expert
question
who told you
that I felt should at
4,000
least have
people
been
when
asked
that was already
and
proven to be
debated.
untrue? Would you trust that expert? I
Was self-evident to me.
Here's the point. The experts are the people who are.
It seemed
meant
that at
to
the
be
very
in
least
charge
that this
of the
was a
health of
question that
country,
should have been
or the
at least
people that give advice
raised
on
and
it.
debated.
Now, the Prime Minister cannot accept experts that are not in official positions. He can't.
But what about people like Carl Hennigan, the Professor of Evidence-Based Medicine from Oxford University? What about my next guest, who's the lead scientist on the Zoe COVID symptom study app and he's Professor of Genetic Epidemiology at King's College London? Are they experts enough to listen to?
Well, yeah, sure. Are they on the stage?
No, but why aren't they on the stage when they've got behavioural psychologists on stage?
They should be putting on, I don't understand why if they're so expert, they should be on the SAGE committee.
Even doubters such as the very genuine Bob Stewart MP were swept along by this powerful following wind and felt they needed to say no more than that they believed in it, as if lockdowns were some sort of religious dogma. As for Sweden, the media told us that they were engaged in some monstrous gamble with death, in spite of the fact that Dr. Neil Ferguson himself had conceded that they had in fact put in stringent measures.
Evidence that the results with the mitigator strategy might have been better than you forecast.
I mean, to be clear, Sweden are not adopting a mitigation strategy, and they're denying they are. They have much more social distancing in place than we modelled for a mitigation strategy. What they have is a sort of semi-suppression strategy.
And finally, and perhaps most importantly, Parliament was not given the chance to properly scrutinise whether the lockdowns were actually working at all.
Sweden, we see with no lockdown, pretty much similar, just pushed out a little, and they're beginning to curl over too, looks like. So again, the same result or better result with no lockdown, and are now only number 22 in the league tables for mortality per million. So Sweden are way down the league tables with no lockdown. Czech Republic, Croatia, Slovenia, they never got a first wave as such because seasonally they got cut out, right? So they were crediting themselves with lockdowns, etc. The reality is it was seasonality primarily. We'll look and we'll see that around October 24th, of its own accord, the infection rate, rolling case rate, fell down fairly dramatically. So the hump was turned and turned right down without a lockdown. If we look at Slovakia, it was getting huge credit recently because it did a massive coerced or forced testing regime, and they credited that with dropping this curve. But notice the drop in infections that happened around the time they did it. If we move that over here, we see that Croatia achieved the same without doing anything. We'll show you Belgium. We'll look and see that they did a 28th October hard lockdown when the deaths were right up. This is way too late to have any effect. And if we look at their rolling case rate, we see that it was falling and kept falling, right, leveled out, independent of the lockdown. Czech Republic never really got a first wave. They did an October 22nd lockdown like Belgium, right? Way too late, and anyway, we know it doesn't work. We look at their case rate was falling already. They do a lockdown, and then it falls and matches pretty much Croatia and others who did later lockdowns. Made no impact. Ireland, we'll show you, 17th October was curling over on the positivity rate in PCR. But they did a full country lockdown on the 22nd, and that might have impacted this curve out here. But as you can see, the curve didn't change in the slightest. We'll show Florida to bring in USA. So Florida death rates are around 5 per million people per day. Back here, this is September 25th. The governor, based on the science and multiple professors he met with, said taking out all restrictions and banning mask fines. And the world went crazy. And they said, oh my God. But this is what happened to the mortality rate. They're doing as good or better than nearly every region in America. But they've taken out the lockdown and the mask mandates.
Perhaps the politicians, for the first time in a long time, felt that they could at last find real purpose in their jobs and take decisive, positive action. Perhaps they felt empowered by the crisis, setting a clear course, ignoring future perils that might befall them, which after all were merely longer-term issues arising only well after their term of office had passed. It's got a GPS, which is basically put a line up on the computer screen here. It will virtually drive itself all the way to Poland without any hassle whatsoever. A wide range of voices and expertise on such other long-term issues had been ignored. Perhaps the same course of action would have been decided upon, but it seemed to me a dereliction of duty by government to ignore all other considerations and prefer only something of an unholy alliance with the doctors, leaving it to them to run the country.
It is important once again.
It was interesting to note that the actions of this particular UK government had a precedent in terms of trying to render Parliament impotent. The same thing had been tried before, during the Brexit debate, quite recently. There, their attempt to prorogue Parliament had been ruled unlawful by the Supreme Court.
The Court is bound to conclude, therefore, that the decision to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification.
Now the courts were silent, with that same leading Supreme Court judge having to resort to something of a footnote in a newspaper article. Finally, the owner appeared, as luck would have it. Are you selling?
Well, I am this summer, actually.
I need to get back to Poland.
Oh, really?
And this boat, this type of boat is just perfect. Sleek, elegant, bit of space. It would get across the Baltic, no problem, I think.
Yeah, I did go from Stockholm last summer, but I think that's the plan.
How much would you sell it for?
Well, I think it's around like 18,000 Swedish crowns.
So it's also a little bit of a kind of midlife crisis, buy a boat sort of scenario.
No, that's way there. Thank you.
Could I perhaps take your email address or something?
Yeah, definitely.
So my conclusions were that the government had ignored previous legislation expressly designed to deal with the crisis, failed to assess impacts on other areas of the economy and society, doggedly relied on unreliable experts and hidden behind their advice, and taken the constitutionally extraordinary step of suspending Parliament for a protracted period of time, stifling proper debate and scrutiny on a subject more important than any government had perhaps faced since wartime. And yet, I wondered whether I had drifted off course.
But you know what? I think I have to give the politicians the benefit of doubt. I don't know how it conceivably possible for the UK government to have done anything else unless they didn't mind committing political suicide. Because when you think about it, as a result of the statistics that they were fed by their medical advisors, which put potential deaths at the 500,000 mark, which is a scary figure whichever way you look at it. And most significantly, that's not a figure that was sort of in closed doors. Most significantly, the advice that the Prime Minister would have been getting from Dominic Cummings and others would have been, look, if you don't lock down the entire country, now that you've got statistics estimating 500,000 people are going to die from a lethal virus, next week, quite frankly, you might as well throw yourself off a bridge, because the press are going to annihilate you. And just think about it. No lockdown or the measured lockdown stroke herd immunity policy that they'd been following previously in line with Sweden, if they continue to follow that policy, if they'd made no change, which makes it actually all the more impressive that Sweden have had the courage of their convictions in that policy, the next week you've got, one death, you've got the headline, government responsible for the British public having ignored their scientific and medical advice. That would have run 4 weeks, and even deaths reaching low hundreds would have been the nail in the coffin, let alone the thousands. So, I just find myself, in a way, seeing the stage upon which this sort of political theatre has been enacted as creating an impossible situation. It's a little bit almost like they've been handed a smoking gun. Yeah, and the detectives walked in, and there they are. They've been right properly framed, both by the domino effects of every other European nation prior to the British having locked down, the scare stories in the press, the horror stories, the horror pictures in the press that had been published online from Italy, the sinister prequel to this drama having taken place in a laboratory in a filthy market in China, the novelty of the virus, the WHO itself, the World Health Organization itself, telling us all it was Armageddon, and then the final nail in the coffin is to get this report. 500,000 people are going to die, Prime Minister, if you don't lock down the entire country. The victim here is the British economy. And because there's so much fog at the moment, we simply don't know how great the damage has done. I have my own hunch there, and that is that, unfortunately, in time, once the fog does clear, and it might take as much as 18 months to clear, people, the great British public, are going to have forgotten about the little old COVID-19 disease. They are going to have got over it, got through it, as I say, quite possibly simply forgotten all about it, and just put it down like we did the AIDS scare or the swine flu scare or the bird flu scare. Can you remember? Are you afraid now, as you listen to me, of contracting AIDS? We were told that it wasn't a homosexual disease, but that heterosexuals were just as exposed as anybody. Do you remember when it first erupted? So we'll have forgotten all of that, and I'm afraid that if there is a serious recession, and if particularly the working classes are losing their jobs and worse, and there's no money to bail them out, fortunately, the current British government could be on the end of a right royal backlash. yeah, could be quite a bloodbath when you think about it. So I feel that perhaps, if anything, these politicians have just been actors on the stage politic, have been playing parts in a drama, not really quite sure what's going on, trying to capitalise on the opportunities as best they can, trying to reflect the mood of the people, trying to get ahead of the story, so to speak. But it's a little bit of a pantomime, isn't it, the daily press briefings? Even those who are 100% behind the lockdown think it's a little bit of a charade. So you start to think about, well, who's pulling the strings backstage, don't you? Who's pulling the strings backstage?
The owner of Pearl did not return my calls or emails. I became resigned to doing nothing but running the gamut of customs via the ferry. Perhaps it was best. Taking action, simply for the sake of taking action, is not always the best policy. As for the politicians, they had no choice but to take action. That is what they do, and it is sometimes better to be seen to be taking action regardless of what action it is that you're taking. Simon Dolan's application for judicial review was doomed to fail, as there was not the public mood for it. The mood was for lockdown. There was this powerful, irresistible force at work, and the government was really no more than a domino, looking back down the line at the inevitability of what is about to happen. But from where had this powerful mood or force arisen? In the age of the internet, a revolutionary technology that could be harnessed to spread information 1,000 times faster than the speed of any virus, it was obvious who the next suspect was. I now needed to turn my attention to the press. I wonder how long it would take to get me from Sweden to Poland in this fella.